All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this month's edition of the Founders First Surviving COVID-19 Business Essentials webinars. I'm Kim Folsom, founder of Founders First and the host for today's webinar. And the title of today's webinar is pretty exciting. It is Got Funded, How Diverse Founders Leverage Alternative Funding Options to Fuel Growth. And the exciting part of this webinar is the fact that we're going to specifically be talking about not access to capital, but actually successful folks that have gotten funded through a variety of different paths that many people are pursuing as they seek to grow their business. To give some background about what we're going to cover, specifically, we're going to give you a little bit about, our goals and objectives for today's webinar. We're going to introduce you to our experts, provide you with some background about alternative funding strategies. Then we're going to get into the meat of our discussion about specific topics. And then we're going to wrap up with questions, answers, as well as upcoming webinars to take into consideration. I'm going to briefly introduce you to our panelists today, and then in a little bit, they're going to go through in a bit more detail about their backgrounds. But I'm delighted to be joined by two fantastic founders. Linda Amara, who is co-founder and CEO of Clarinet Solutions, and Adam Riggs-Zeigen, of a founder and chairman of Rock My World Media. And giving you a little bit of background, these webinars are targeted to the population that Founders First supports. These are small businesses that range in a variety of different shapes and sizes. These may be companies that are small as a couple folks grinding it out as a specialty professional or type of services, to mid-sized companies that may be 20 or so employees, service-based or manufacturing businesses, or even those larger businesses that are 50 to 100 employees. Again, service-like manufacturing, tech-enabled solutions. So monthly, we put on these webinars to address key issues to help address the challenges that businesses of these sizes face with their growth. And specifically, today's webinar is specifically about finding out how diverse-led businesses are turning to alternative funding sources, and what some of their options are, and then true stories of how they've been able to succeed and obtain that amount of funding. A bit of background about the most often used methods that are for either startup or growth funding, believe it or not, is personal savings and assets. We're going to talk a little about the percentage, but these are the 8 common method. Friends, family are the other. People seek to tap into angel investors as another big source. And depending on their path, their growth prospects of the business, they may eventually get access to a more traditional VC, but more of it may be some angels, and you're going to hear some stories about that. Credit cards and various types of debt loan is a common method that's used. Profit or revenue sharing investment is another method. Crowdfunding is another one, grants or retained earnings. And these are the most common 8 methods that are used by businesses as they're seeking capital to grow their business. A bit about the actual percentage of those types. We talked about personal savings. Believe it or not, some 65% use either personal assets or savings of the founders or owners to fund their businesses startup and growth. The other is bank financing. Some 16, 17% use some sort of bank financing to do that. The others are much, much smaller in comparison. Personal credit cards are probably the next, established one. And then when you look at, bundling between personal savings, personal family savings, or the family home loan, you can bundle that into probably 75%. And then, then there's a much, much smaller percentage where you can see as far as the percentage allocated by venture capital. So, folks are using other different sources, a lot of personal assets and so forth to be able to support their growth. For some of you that are in our audience that are looking at, really kind of keen on using equity financing and have aspirations of gaining funding through venture financing, that is a very small amount, as you saw on the other slide. And if you're a diverse founder, it's less than 1%. Additionally, when you take into consideration the amount of venture funding, 80% of it goes to a very small regional cluster. The Bay Area and New York are, two of the biggest areas where most of that funding goes to. And then the 20% goes to other regions, and take those things into consideration as well. Another piece when you think about your funding journey is you've got to take into consideration what you're bringing to the table as you're looking at that funding journey. One has to do with the market that you're going after, and we call it this funding conundrum, where there's 4 key criteria that has an impact as to your ability to attract that funding, and the dominance and size of the market. So it's not just the size of the market, but your potential positioning in the market. The other has to do with the strength of the founding team, their expertise, and what they've done before that gives them the experience and know-how to be successful. The other area has to do with your model and how likely you're able to build significant wealth and economic impact for your investors in the market you serve. And then last but not least is traction, proof of adoption of what you're doing in the market. And these 4 things combined together have an impact with regards to your ability to attract capital. You can see they're weighted differently, and we'll get a chance with our panelists to hear what their takes are of these 4 different criteria. So, and with that, I'd like to introduce you to our subject matter experts, and starting with Miss Linda Amaro. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you. It's good to be here, Kim.
Well, great. Well, if you can share with our audience a bit about your background, talk about your what Clarinet Solutions has been and kind of the stage of the business. And if you can highlight what some of the types of fundings that you have considered with your business. And then finally, if you might share one challenge that you might have had with raising funds for your company.
Got it. Okay. So historically, I have a traditional IT background. I spent many, many, many years in building data centers, very large systems, running very large databases and server systems, and you name it. We just did the whole thing. Then our clients were tier 1 companies. So they would be companies that had 10,000 employees or more. So we were used to dealing in that kind of space. Back when the internet came into being and the .com and, or some would say .bomb, when things kind of blew apart, when the investments kind of went belly up, it changed and it caused a shift in even what we were doing as a company that served large organizations. People had to go a different direction. So it kind of set in motion a whole thing of outsourcing and nearshoring, or, when you take a look at how the landscape was for the labor workforce, it became global at that point. And with that, I had an initiative that was called Wahoo, which was work at home office opportunity. So rather than going to a 6th building, we decided to break our campuses apart and have people work remotely. Well, the internet wasn't quite what it is today. And so we had to come up with ways to make that happen. But it really piqued an interest to me about how the workforce and the labor force was shifting, and that more and more people were going to be working remotely. So I had an initiative to actually start that action of creating an environment and the technologies to support that kind of business. And unfortunately, the way it came about this year was kind of shocking in a way, because one of the challenges that we face, even to get funding, was it's a shift in a mindset of going from brick and mortar to having a remote workforce. It's a shift to go and take a look at what's available around the world so that economies everywhere could benefit. Banks weren't used to it. Lenders weren't used to it. Angel investors weren't used to it. So they didn't have the vision at the time. But this year, with the advent of COVID-19, it disrupted every business. And people had to go home and work. And what became apparent, even for our own clients that we had been working with for the last 10 years, discovered they were not ready for it either. So it was this total shift, but that was one of the challenges, was we were changing the landscape of how business is done. And many investors were not quite there with us yet. So that was one of the challenges. And when we looked for funding, most of our funding was friends and family who believed in what we could do and deliver our historical record of what we've been able to produce, and, and lead the way, champion. And this is kind of, one place that I've never wanted to be is the bleeding edge of any technology, but we were at the bleeding edge through the inception and creation of our business.
Oh, great. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. And if you had to highlight one specific challenge with regards to your fundraising journey for Clarinet, what might you share?
Well, in the past, the traditional funding just was not going to work for us.
Mhm.
So the challenge we had was finding something that would fit what we were looking for. And quite frankly, the founders of Clarinet did not want to necessarily give up, especially after all the investment we'd already put in, to give up the right to have a say of how the business was run. So finding a funding option that allowed us the freedom to still make our choices. And nobody knew the landscape of our business better than we did.
Mhm.
And since it was new and innovative and nobody else was doing it, it made it difficult to find anybody who could really support that. And that was when looking at the revenue-based financing or the royalty-based financing really made sense to us. It was a fit it was kind of like a future fit for a future business.
Well, great. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Thanks, Linda. And next, I'd like to introduce everyone to Adam Rigzigan, who is the founder of Rock My World Media. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Kim. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, please share with our group a bit about your background, as well as about your organization Solution, some of the types of funding you raised, and maybe highlight one challenge with regards to your fundraising journey.
Sure, my pleasure. So by way of background, I am kind of your typical serial entrepreneur. So I've started a number of businesses throughout my career, kind of starting, in the college days and progressing through to now. I have traditionally taken on a product and marketing role in the companies that I founded. So, I really kind of quantify my expertise as somebody who looks at an environment, a problem that's occurring for a number of users, and thinking about how a solution can, be brought to market. For Rock My World Media, that was specifically around exercise. So at Rock My World Media, we developed a mobile application and set of services called Rock My Run, which was all around manipulating music in real time to help runners and other active people better enjoy exercise and better perform while they're doing it. We were lucky enough to start that from, really ground zero, started with some personal savings and then some friends and family money, and grew that to debuting on the Inc. 5000 list at number 883, which is an accomplishment I'm very proud of.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Along the way, we raised about $2 million of almost all sorts of funding. So, as I mentioned, there was personal savings involved. There were early friends and family who believed in us, believed in our mission of trying to make the world a more active and healthier world. That progressed to angel funding, primarily here in Southern California, where the company is based, but also as far away as Texas, the south coast of Texas. We were able to recruit some angel investors, and then progressing through to strategic investors. So along our journey, we found some strategic partners that were interested in investing in helping us build out our solution and attack this market. Definitely pursued the VC route and wasn't able to secure VC level funding, and I can talk to why that wasn't something that we were successful with. And then progressing through to revenue-based financing once we had an established model of here's how we could generate revenue, and we could do it on in a profitable way. So really explored a bunch of different paths to financing to getting the company up and running. In addition to founding Rock My World, I've spent time at other high-profile startups, some that have raised 20 million plus in terms of funding. So I've seen that side of things. I participated in investment discussions while at Qualcomm and some of the due diligence teams there, looking at back in the day investments into Fitbit and Spotify and other startups. So really, I've had a holistic view of what it takes to raise money for companies. In terms of, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Oh, okay. In terms of a specific challenge that I faced with Rock My World, it's kind of an interesting one, and anybody who has any business that targets a consumer is likely to run into this. So when I would pitch to investors, they would want to try out the product, regardless of whether they were actually in the target market. They wanted to get their hands on it and feel it, and then hand it to friends and family to see if they liked it. And more often, and one of the things that happened more frequently than I expected is they would hand it to a family member and say, they didn't like it, so we're not going to invest. And that wasn't one of the criteria that was listed on that slide of like team and traction and all that. Sometimes it's just a very personal decision and more subjective than I had anticipated. So that was definitely a challenge. On the flip side, I was successful in raising money from people who got it immediately. Investors who were also runners, as an example, because we had a running targeted product, were able to understand it quickly and decided to place investment. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in that sense.
Well, thanks so much for sharing that. And I'd like to, kick off this Q&A portion of our discussion, specifically around this whole perception of VC financing. So many people talk about, I've got this startup and I'm going to raise a Series A. And, you guys have, with each of your respective businesses, been in market 5, 10, years or so. What do you, I have been, gone through, 4 different Series A experiences before. And it's interesting to me how so many people look at that as the big milestone. Curious to know you guys's, perspective with regards to that as part of the, business build journey. and how important or maybe not that might be, and what advice might you share to other business owners that are, have that as a key milestone?
Who would you like to go first?
How about you start, Adam?
Sure. So I think it's all, business and generally life in general comes down to, what do you want to accomplish? What are your goals? If your goal is to create a company that generates hundreds of millions of dollars and changes the world, you're going to require a lot of investment to do that. The VC is a perfectly viable route. But understand what the consequences are that come with that. It's highly risky. It will require all of your time. It's incredibly competitive. I'm a big sports fan, and so I liken it to other, kind of competitive pursuits. And I don't mean competitive necessarily within your industry. I mean competitive in terms of other companies that are trying to raise capital. And so you have to be the fraction of the percent of companies to be able to do that. And if that is your goal, then that is a perfectly valid goal. Just understand what all that involves. For the overwhelming majority of companies, that's not a viable route. They're not going to participate in a market that is large enough to support hundreds of millions in revenue. And so the idea that VC funding is appropriate for these companies is just false. And so I think for those with companies that don't have that goal, that have maybe more modest goals, maybe more lifestyle goals, they want to be able to have weekends, have evenings. They don't want to sacrifice all other areas of their life for their business. Then VC just isn't really the route. And there's very viable other ways to fund it that still are appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would look at, when you think about your exposure to Series A investment from be it Fitbit, Spotify, and what you did as part of the investment teams with Qualcomm, and you compare that to the journey of people that are running today, much earlier stage companies, where there are some specific unique differentiators with regards to either model or team or position in the market that made those businesses much more viable to receive a Series A investment than what you see more often?
Sorry, so is the question, what makes the Fitbits and Spotifys of the world different than?
Yeah, the likely candidates then, I mean, I agree. I think that it's the 1% that are the Series A. It didn't used to be that small of a percentage, but I think in the competitive landscape, that's where it is. I mean, some people may say that if you're in the Bay Area, it may be 5% that is able to receive a Series A financing. But just when you think about, these companies being able to successfully close a Series A versus, the majority of those that don't, what do you think might be the big difference for those?
I think it's, I think there's probably three primary factors, one of which is market size, right? So if you look at a Spotify, and I was lucky enough to sit in the Qualcomm Ventures office in an early version of Spotify. And it was completely changing how people consume music. That is a huge vision, right? I mean, that affects everyone in the world, how they consume music. And so that's number one, having a vision that is gigantic. And similarly with Fitbit, right? So I think that's number one. Number two is combined with that vision, the market. So, you always hear you have to go after these multi-billion-dollar markets if you want to pursue VC, and that's generally true. If the market you're going after isn't billions of dollars, it will not fit the VC model. And then three, sadly, it's network. And that certainly applies to other types of fundraising as well. But if you're not connected to people that have access to that type of capital, it's going to be much, much harder, even if you do have that vision and that market, to actually raise that capital. So that's why I think you see most of the VC capital deployed to major metropolitan hubs, because you have a concentration of people who have experience investing in companies that have these visions in these markets. And so they kind of deploy it in those regions, and you just have likely a better network with those people.
Yep. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. I'm going to go on to our questions, and thinking about kind of what is the specific ways when you think about your business and where you're seeking to take it. I'm going to go back to this slide. So when you think about specifically, the type of business you have, like Linda, you run largely a service-based business, and have chose to use revenue-based investment as an option for funding growth. How have you, arrived at that particular conclusion or selection type compared to either traditional debt, and why?
Well, it's interesting because we did look at all the different avenues that would be available. And I think, like Adam said, when you look at 75% of the businesses out there are small. They're not large businesses. So really and truly, they're not going to be candidates or widely accepted for some of the traditional funding methods. Even going to the bank and getting a bank loan, was one of the options that we looked at. And in one way, our request for funding was so little because what we needed was to have assistance with marketing. We're great technologists. If you think of propeller heads, that's probably us. But we didn't have the skill sets for some of the areas and disciplines to help grow the business, which was in sales and marketing. So we didn't need a huge investment, didn't need a large investment. We needed something to get us to move forward and have that momentum to build those tools that we needed, our marketing materials and collateral material that we could use to give out or to hand out, or even, our website. Yeah, it sounds funny. I know it's cobbler's children have no shoes, right? Well, an IT organization, sometimes your own website is the last thing that you think about. So we needed some expertise and help in funding those types of activities, which was not a big investment. So from that perspective, looking at what's available, and then did we want to give up, ownership of our company in order to fund some of those projects? That was the other decision point that we had. And to be quite honest, that the partners had invested so much time in their own resources into the company that it didn't make sense for such a small amount of money to give up your right to control it. So we had to find an alternative solution.
Okay, well, thanks so much for sharing that. And then Adam, you mentioned that you've raised capital from strategic investment. Can you share a little bit about that process and how that might be different from like raising equity investment?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a function still of how much you put out into the world, what you're doing, and how differentiated and interesting it is. So in our case, we were able to secure some strategic investment from a large smartphone manufacturer and a large headphone manufacturer. And the way that it came about was really having a clear focus on the problem that we were solving. How do you get people to enjoy exercise more in a differentiated way? Really our PR, our marketing efforts helped to get the attention of these companies who shared a similar vision and focus. One of which, the headphone company, was very serendipitous. The CEO reached out on LinkedIn after seeing, you know, our posts and our content about the technology that we were developing for this particular solution, some of our intellectual property around it, and reached out and said, hey, we share a similar mission. You guys are dealing with music. We have headphones. Maybe there's, you know, a potential partnership here. It still does take time. It's not a slam dunk by any means. As soon as you get in contact with these groups, they still do have investment, thesis, how much they're willing to set aside for companies. But it was all around, you're working on something complementary to what we're working on, and therefore, you know, it makes sense for us to place this investment. And I will say it's still like I think a lot of investment experiences comes down to a personal relationship. So for this company, kind of a funny story. The CEO was engaged, his team was engaged, and I said, well, why don't I come out to your offices and we can talk about this investment? And he said, sure, come out, that would be great. So I just booked a flight to their headquarters without saying, I was going to be in town, and then just sat in the airport and waited to see if I could get a meeting that week. And that placed kind of more pressure on the situation. I said, hey, I'm here. While I'm here, why don't I stop by? And then, they were very fitness focused company from a headphone standpoint. And so I said, sure, why don't you come and exercise with me? Well, the CEO was an Ironman, like in incredible shape. This was at altitude. I was dying. I was not in a position to be exercising with him. And after we're done, he said, that's great. Thanks for coming by. We'll connect. I can't even catch my breath. I said, well, can we talk about this investment decision? He said, oh, come by the office. And that formed the foundation for the relationship that eventually led to the investment. So even though they're strategic partners, and of course they have funds aligned for it, it's still a personal relationship that ultimately can close the deal.
Yes, and I appreciate the story that you told, because I think about how I got connected to many of my investors. It wasn't one of those that, oh, you make this request, oh, you're interested in investing with us, let's have a meeting, and boom, it happens. My first company that I got my first Series A investment from, it was probably 18 months before I finally got the term sheet from them. And with that, I met them at a conference. And then I had, I think I had a couple conversations, and it was a similar thing after the third one. It's like, I need to be able to have a deeper level of relationship with them. And so I was going to the East Coast for some other thing, and said, oh, I'm going to be here for some other meetings, would welcome the opportunity to meet, somebody else on their team, and let them see, a demo of something that we were doing. And, it's just going through that various journey that, you find a way to, there's no guarantee going through this exercise that your relationship will build to that level, but you have to have a certain level of mutual trust and respect before you're even going to get to that level of conversation.
Yeah, I think, people make fundraising out to be more complicated than it is. It's really just a sales process. And if you're a founder, if you're a CEO, you have to be able to sell, in my opinion, whether that's to recruit talented people to your team, whether it's to recruit equity investors, whether it's to secure a deal for revenue-based financing or a bank loan. It's all a sales process, in addition to having to sell to your customers. So I think it's really refining that process and just appreciating that that's what it is, helps to simplify, this this fundraising experience.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I'm going to drill down a little bit deeper with regards to both those two strategies. With regards to revenue-based financing for you, Linda, that was the path that you utilized to invest in, take investment in your business. You know, for some people, this is a new concept, especially, you know, pre Shark Tank. Some people had never heard of, you know, revenue-based financing. How did you and your team get familiar with that, you know, that method as an alternative compared to traditional debt or equity?
Well, the first time that I had been exposed to it was through the Founders Boot Camp. We went through the program and we had a session on the different avenues that you could take for funding. And after that, we actually went out and researched different companies that do the revenue-based or the royalty-based financing. And they have different programs that are offered in each. So it kind of, we went down that path and made a decision as a team that this would be a good way for us to go. And then we looked to see what the resources would be available to us and what the cost would be. Now, the one thing with revenue-based financing, it is a little more expensive than some of the other funding opportunities that are there. But because we got to keep our business as our business and be in the position of making the decisions, that was what was important to us. We understood our industry better than anybody. So that came into play. That had a huge part in it. And then the other part was that with choosing and selecting founders provided us the resources where we knew we were weak. So the lack of experience and expertise we had in marketing, say, we could tap into that resource and we would have some of the best resources available to us. You know, so for us, that was worth the investment that we made and worth getting this type of funding. It really made a difference and was the catalyst for us to grow our business multiple times.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And Adam, when you took on the investment from, I think was it the firm Skull Candy, right? Did they participate with an existing round? Did you have to go through some other special did they participate with an existing round of investment, or did you have to start something new to get their participation?
Yeah, we structured something, you know, fairly common called a convertible note. So while technically it's debt, it's intended to convert to equity at some point. So, you know, they participated in one of those. But if I could, I'd like to go back to the revenue-based financing piece because we did some of that as well. And Linda, I'll be curious to see if you agree with this. I think a lot of that boils down to kind of customer economics, meaning can you acquire a customer for less than they generate in terms of the lifetime value? In other words, can you acquire a customer for $100 and have them generate $300, a return on the acquisition? To me, that was one of the key factors for us in pursuing revenue-based financing, and I'm curious if that was similar for you.
It was actually on not only on acquiring but retaining. So and the expansion in doing our recurring revenue. So we were actually shifting our whole model on the services that we were offering. So there's a transformation that took place in the company. As I said, we're really great technologists. We're not necessarily strategists when it looks at the different programs that could be offered. And that was the guidance we'd gotten from founders, which was, when I look at it today, our shift is 75% in the direction of the recurring revenue.
Right.
So it made a huge difference for us.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing for folks listening to this to keep in mind if they're considering a revenue-based financing approach, is you have to have a model that makes sense for that, where you can put a small amount of money in one end of the machine and reasonably, reliably actually expect more money to come out the other end. Because if you have that, you know, money machine, if you will, then you can keep funneling in investment, and you know what's going to come out the other end, and that makes the revenue-based financing so much more easy to achieve, to secure, and B, helps to offset some of the costs associated that Linda talked about.
Yeah. And so, kind of picking up on that as far as the business economic model and traction and having that be the impact of your ability to raise funds when you think about, especially, how much of that, when you think about where you were at the stage of raising the funds that you raised and where you are today, because I think sometimes in the market, people may pursue these avenues or maybe think that the transactions will close quickly. But, how much of it do you think that your economic model and traction have on your ability to raise the funding that you did? I'd start with you, Linda, and then we're interested in hearing your take, Adam.
Let me think about that a minute. So I want to make sure, can you restate the question again?
I just said, as far as when you think about your model, your business model, like you guys had a transaction and recurring model and the level of traction, customers, revenue, how much do you think that has an impact on your ability to successfully raise funds?
Well, you need to have the traction or a model in place that's actually going to generate that. What's interesting is, unlike in your venture capital where they're looking to have X amount returned to them, because they're in the business of making money, that's why they invest in the company. In the revenue-based financing, it's based on what we said that we needed to achieve and what we needed to do. And the funding was provided to us to be able to grow that. But without having something in the recurring revenue, without having a way for it to repeat itself, you couldn't predict the growth that was going to be there. The opportunity for us was that we had clients, we had customers, we had those relationships. What we didn't have was a good model to be able to keep the repeating of the revenue coming in. And that shift and change in what we could demonstrate, because we had the skills and we had the clients already, it gave us the base and the platform to go from. So that when we asked for an investment to come in, we knew what it was going to take and where it was going. It was much easier to predict because of the existing and underlying systems that we had in place. Those structures, I think, made a difference. And in your
particular situation, you guys added a number of additional recurring revenue streams to an existing customer base.
The other thing that we added were partnerships too. So we opened up different channels. It was no longer just us selling to, client to client or a B2B. It was us selling to our partner who was selling to a business. So, and building the structure. So not only the recurring revenue, but expanding the number of partners or people. If you think of a swimming pool, we all are going after the same clients. We're in different lanes, which could be different types of offerings. And we didn't step on one another. They were a good partner to us, because we're going after the same customer, so we could leverage those things. Having the recurring revenue and that opportunity opened up a door for some of these partners to be able to offer something new to their clients. So it was a win-win all the way around.
Well, thanks so much for sharing that, Linda. How about you, Adam? When you think about your specific model with Rock My World and the traction that you had, how much of an impact did that have for you to be able to raise, the various types of funds that you were able to raise?
It was everything. I mean, just full stop, period. Like, without traction, and unless you're a founder that has a track record of producing returns for investors, it's going to be nearly impossible to raise money. So you have to prove that whatever you have, people want. That's a key part of business. And investment, you always hear, especially when it comes to equity investment, that they're risk takers. They are not risk takers. And if you look at debt, it's even less interested in taking risk. So your job as a founder, if you want to if you want to raise money, is to reduce risk. You should do that for yourself in the beginning. If you're putting in your own savings, it shouldn't just be like, hey, I'm going to throw some money at this thing, unless you have that kind of savings, which you're probably not on this webinar. Mitigate the risk somewhat. You know, have a plan, have a model, show some traction, show that there's at least somebody interested in what you're offering. That's traction. Now you can build off of that. Raise a little bit more money from a different source. Build on the traction. These are foundations. These are bricks in the building. However, whatever analogy you want to use, but ultimately that's what's going to allow you to progress. Invest some. Build some traction, prove you're able to deliver something that is interesting to an audience, raise some more funding, prove that you use that funding effectively so that you can deliver some more and stack those wins on top of each other. And before you know it, you'll have more interest from more people that will can see how you can provide them returns. Because whether it's debt, whether it's equity, I would argue that investors aren't there to feel good. Of course, there's some social investors and a part of that market, but generally investors want a return. They're giving up some of their money so they get more back. And so you have to prove that you can do that.
Okay. And thanks so much for sharing that. So what advice might you give to a diverse founder-led business with regards to, you know, raising capital for their business? Perhaps Linda, or you, from a woman's perspective of raising capital for to grow their business, what advice might you share?
It's interesting because as a woman, I did find that there were challenges in some of the banks are actually very traditional, and if you weren't a man, it was a little bit different conversation, I think, than it was for a woman. And even though it shouldn't be that way, it was that way. So it was having to prove that we could do things, that we proved that we had the wherewithal, proving the constant that we have the skill sets and that we could deliver on what we promised our customers. In fact, if we didn't have the track record that we had and the customers that we served, and I'm very thankful for the my growth in the corporate arena and dealing with very large companies and organizations. So I had contacts and connections that were really beneficial when it came time to either have funding conversations or moving ahead. So it wasn't as though I was coming from ground zero like some companies are. I had that wherewithal and that knowledge from my prior existence in the corporate arena. But it was a challenge, and getting people to listen and to believe that we could do this, that was my challenge, and having to sell them on that and the proven track record. That was the biggest challenge that I had.
And so, one piece of advice may be, being able to leverage your specific traction and track record as a way of mitigating any potential, concern as far as your ability to execute or provide a return. Would that be fair?
Yes, that would be fair. And also to take a look at it's almost like I did an assessment of my entire network of my contacts and connections, as to even doing informational interviews of how they could, what would they say, how would they best position, what their perspective and view. And it didn't matter if they were male or female or what company they were with. I had a network of people that I could tap into and pull information from. Mm-hmm. And that made a difference. So it built confidence. It helped us set direction. It helped us refine our message. It helped us really understand what we were asking for and know what we wanted to achieve. Mm-hmm. So those were very key things, but those came out of those informational interviews from the network.
Well, thanks so much for sharing that. How about you, Adam? What advice might you share with a diverse founder-led business about strategies for raising capital to grow their business?
Yeah, I think that there's a few things that come to mind. One of which is fight the urge to feel defensive. You know, it's very easy when it's clear that there's a different playing field, or you're being treated differently. My favorite example I use is in the course of trying to raise, in the course of raising angel funding, I would go to some events, there would be angel investors there, and I would notice other people, they would shake their hand and this is of course pre-COVID times when people shook hands.
Right.
But you know, people would get a general handshake.
Uh-huh.
Some people would come up to me and try to do a funny handshake,
Oh,
like
like
was
a
like,
fist bump or something.
yeah, like this was appropriate for this environment. I'm like, just shake my hand. But it kind of, you know, gives you insight into how you're being viewed. And so it's very easy in those situations to feel defensive, especially when you get rejected, and you will get rejected a lot. I firmly believe it's important to not feel as though the cards are stacked against you, like it's unfair. You will get rejected a lot. Everybody gets rejected a lot. So try to mitigate that feeling of being defensive, and it's because of the color of my skin or my nationality or my gender or anything like that. Two, I think coming back to the previous point, investors want a return. And so ultimately, if you can make people money and you can prove that you can do that, that will mitigate a lot of these other issues. Not all of them, of course. People will bring their own biases, and you can't control that. But if you have a track record, if you demonstrated traction, if you say you're going to do something and then you do it, you know, I hate to admit it, but you know, investors can be greedy. They want to make money. So if you prove that you can do that, that will get you much farther along in the process.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have always led with traction and just, you know, focused it on those types of things. And I know the other side of it is not being afraid to ask, you know, criteria, you know, if they're willing to share kind of what criteria and past experiences, you know, have
Yep.
you know, what is your past investment experience and who did you invest in and why did you invest in them? Just to, you know, take everything as a learning experience, you know.
Yeah, hey Kim, I just want to point out, especially for the listeners, the advice that you just gave is invaluable, because any event that you're going to or any circle of people that you're with, those are the types of questions that you should be asking.
Mhm.
You need to tap into those people. Think of them now as part of your network. It's an opportunity to learn from them. But those very things made a difference for me
Mhm.
personally. I didn't take it personal that I was being disrespected because I was a woman or I was being looked at down. To be honest with you, the first time people would meet me, they would ask, "So where's your CEO?" They wouldn't get that that was my role,
Mhm.
you know. And so I changed my own behavior and how I was asking my questions,
Mhm.
you know, and making sure it became very clear as to what role I had.
Mhm. Well,
So
thanks so much for sharing that. And curious to know if you were to provide one piece of advice to a member of our audience that were seeking to raise um, capital from some of the alternative sources that we've talked about today, what one piece of advice might you share? Adam, we'll start with you.
Um, I would share, aside from some of the other pieces, brag about what you're doing. I mean, people want to, at any level, be associated with winners. Certainly in our case, when it came to some of the strategic investment, bragging about, talking about, they would call it content marketing, about what you're doing, the successes that you're having, the progress that you're making. Putting that out there can pay dividends. It's not, you know, it'll be hard to quantify a direct return on investment for that. But generally speaking, I would say share what you're doing, share how you're progressing, share your wins, and that will lead to, you know, these type of serendipitous interactions that can often lead to investment.
Thanks so much for sharing that. How about you, Linda? What one piece of advice might you give to our audience about pursuing some of the methods we talked about today?
In addition to what Adam already shared, the one thing that I would add would be to know your why. Why do you exist as a business? You know, what is it that your contribution to your community or to a society or to cultural shift or whatever, what are you bringing to the table? Because I find in today's arena that most people are willing to buy into the bigger picture and want to be a support to that. And along with the things that Adam said, just adding a why you exist makes a difference.
Well, thanks so much for sharing that. I'm gonna, let's see, we don't happen to have any questions, but I'm gonna transition to, first of all, thank you guys for joining us today and sharing this wonderful insight about strategies for, raising alternative funds of capital and your success stories that you actually achieved. And then I want to sign up by sharing about some of our upcoming events. Next month, November, we're going to have 2 events like we usually do. Our first will be our fireside chat event, and that will be held on November 9th at 5 o'clock. And our speaker will be Francisco de Jesus, who's the CEO of Universal Displays. And we're going to be talking about mastering a niche market, specifically through acquisition and private equity. He actually acquired that business and has doubled it in size. So he'll talk about that journey. And then our November COVID-19 Essentials webinar will be about adding recurring revenue streams to scale your business. And please, I invite you to visit our website at Founders First CDC to register for those webinars. And with that, thanks so much for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Kim. Bye.
Bye-bye.